Alright guys, welcome back to F1 News. Drama potentially brewing again in the Red Bull camp, with Sergio Perez suggesting that if Red Bull, the team, do not support his ambitions of where he wants to be this season, he will not give them the support in return. This comes after a tricky season of Perez, where even at the start of last year, team orders were being made in favour of Verstappen. Perez certainly doesn't want that to occur again, and if it does, he might start to be a little bit more selfish in the way he drives on track. Very much intrigued to your thoughts in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. Verstappen and Red Bull are very confident for this weekend. He was asked the question in the press conference today, where is this year's car, the RB19, better than last year's car, the RB18? Verstappen says, everywhere. Everything is better. The understeer, the oversteer, the balance, it's kind of impressive that's even possible given how early it is in the season for Red Bull. Of course, their car is much lighter though than last year's, so that of course is always a massive advantage on effectively all elements of the car, and we'll see how far Red Bull are ahead of their opposition when it comes to certainly qualifying in Bahrain is where we're really going to start to see how things are going. But this season, in terms of how well Red Bull can do and even how well Verstappen can do, comes down to their opposition, but also comes down to the internal team chemistry. In terms of average pace between drivers, I think Mercedes with Russell and Hamilton are right there. I think Ferrari with Charles Leclerc and Sainz might be right there. With Red Bull's case, with Verstappen and Perez, there's quite a distance at times. Certainly there was last season, and Perez would say that that was in large part due to Red Bull favouring Verstappen over Perez. You can understand why they do this, but if there are more teams in the conversation for getting a front row start on the grid, then if Perez is starting further back on the grid, then it makes it a little bit more difficult for Verstappen to hold off. Let's say there is some more teamwork going on in terms of strategy and other options, going for the undercut, going for the overcut. If Perez is too far behind Verstappen, then he can't necessarily support that challenge as he has done in the past. Charles Leclerc says for Ferrari though, that they didn't show their full potential in testing, but neither did Red Bull. So yeah, people seem to believe right now Red Bull are the team to beat, and people would expect right now a 1-2 for Red Bull this weekend. But as the season progresses, as other cars develop and as other cars unlock more performance, we're hoping that gap will close, at least for the sake of a competitive season, and where Perez fits into that is a key question. Most teams, as I say, believe that Red Bull are going to be in a league of their own. That might be the case for the first few races of the season, but rumour has it that over time that gap may well close down. Now, Perez was asked, what do you feel about the year? Because of course he's in a position again to try and challenge for a world title. Last year there was the conversation around about Baku and Monaco, with Perez having some good performances over Max Verstappen at the time, whether Perez could actually challenge Max for the title. It wasn't long before all of that was put to bed, and Perez, Max won 15 races last year, Perez won 2, and both of them were arguably, fortuitous to a certain extent. Yes, you could argue in Saudi Arabia he was kind of unlucky with the safety car timing after getting on pole there to not be able to deliver the victory, but also, Singapore, the way things went for Max that weekend with of course him winning, and also Monaco with the Ferrari disaster class. So, Perez will obviously have looked to have done better, and he did say last year that the way Red Bull have developed their car was in favour of Verstappen's very twitchy, very, sharp front-end style that doesn't really suit Perez particularly well. Now, Marco says, Helmut Marco, that they are going to be able to resolve that this year, and they're going to have potentially use ballast. So if you put more ballast towards the front of the car becomes more understeery that Perez likes. You put it towards the back of the car, becomes a bit more oversteery that Verstappen tends to like. So maybe they can work around that to a certain extent. And Perez does say here that, look, he expects to get the support of his team, as of course he would, but he also mentions in quite an interesting statement here. Now, this is in Spanish originally, and I'm not, fluent in Spanish, so I've just looked around for people to actually translate this, and people seem to think that that translation is relatively accurate. If you guys speak Spanish, feel free to let us know in the comments below. I'll share the clip for you guys. Might have to be pixelated a little bit to make sure that Fox Sports doesn't slam the old copyright strike. Basically what he says though, it depends on how selfish he can be. In the end, teamwork is always important, as Perez knows full well, but if he doesn't receive the support that he wants, I won't necessarily give my support back.
Se habla de eso, del equipo, pero los grandes campeones son muy egoístas. ¿Qué tanto más egoísta puedes ser tú este año?
Bueno, todo dependerá, ¿no? Pero al final es importante siempre trabajar en equipo y obviamente si veo que no recibo el apoyo cuando lo necesito, yo tampoco lo daré, eso es obvio.
Now, he went on to say afterwards, right, that like, hey, like, this is not what he expects to happen, but nonetheless, the statement was made, and of course he wouldn't expect it to happen. He drives for Red Bull, but still, he knows what happened last season with potentially they favour the car for Verstappen, and even relatively early days last year, after Verstappen had 2 difficult races in Bahrain and then at Melbourne, like after, even 5 races into the season or whatever it was in Spain, 5 5-6 races in, there were team orders going on that Perez didn't particularly like at the time and even over the course of the season. Of course, it all kicked off in Brazil, where all of this boiled over, where Verstappen refused to yield to Perez after Perez kind of let him pass towards the end of the race to try and challenge for some more points. And then Perez was going off on the main stage after this one saying, if Max has 2 championships, it's thanks to me, which, okay, you could argue that's true for the first World Championship. For the second World Championship, maybe not so much. And he also said it shows who he truly is, right? And kind of, well, obviously that weekend was massive drama for the Red Bull camp, but, don't just think that it's gone away just because we're at the start of a new season. Like, obviously the friction will remain there to a certain extent, and now Perez is like, look, if Red Bull don't support me, if they don't respect me as a driver in my ambitions to become the world champion, and many would say, look, Perez, just be realistic, take the second driver seat at Red Bull, try and pick up the victories you can, and take a relatively successful Formula 1 career, all things considered. Perez wants more than that, though. I'm sure he wants to challenge, and if he feels like in relatively, in early days of the season that he's being asked to just be the supportive guy, he's been asked to sacrifice himself for the benefit of Verstappen, then he's not going to be so happy. And it does therefore raise the question, will Perez in certain situations start to behave more selfishly on track, and what are the consequences if he was to? If Hamilton's coming up behind him or whatever, and maybe he could defend very hard, or he could say, you know what, Red Bull, I'm not really feeling it today. Hamilton, here you go, off you go chase down Max, or whatever in this kind of, hypothetical world. And one of the examples I want to give of this was the Spanish Grand Prix from last season, where it was an interesting point of the race where Verstappen was behind George Russell. The Mercedes was pretty good that weekend, but Verstappen had the DRS malfunction that prevented him from overtaking. So Perez was asking on the radio, like, hey, Red Bull, just let me pass Max here. I'll be able to get Russell pretty easily because I've got on the better tyre strategy at the moment, and I've got DRS actually functioning. I'll get past Russell, then, you can let me do my race on the slightly different strategy to Max, and Max can do his race. Now, by keeping Perez stuck behind Max for lap after lap, that meant that Perez's strategy was ruined, and Verstappen's ended up being much better. Verstappen won the race. Perez wasn't happy at all about this after the race, and that's even, in my opinion, one of the reasons why he might have, if this is indeed true, maybe spun intentionally in Monaco to force Verstappen to start behind him to kind of get revenge in that sense. That's at least what I think might be the cause of this, if this is indeed true, that he was frustrated at the way that Red Bull dealt with that situation in Spain. Despite being so few races into the season, Verstappen obviously dominated the championship at the end of it, and I'm sure Perez felt pretty hard done by there, especially given how early those team orders were being handed out by Red Bull. So what if Perez does become a bit more selfish and doesn't necessarily agree with what the team does in certain senses? Is that going to be the end for Perez in the Red Bull, right? Is it possible that if Perez isn't so compliant with what Red Bull want to do, because they say they've got no number one driver, but, let's be honest here, the way that Red Bull operate, and you can understand exactly why they do that, and also they've got Daniel Ricciardo now in reserve. So that is the argument going around right now, that, well, if Perez doesn't play ball, maybe Perez needs to realize that he's got to play ball, and I thought maybe he had done, but by these comments he's saying, look, if they don't show me the support, I'm not going to support them back, which is, quite the statement to make, especially with Daniel Ricciardo possibly knocking on the door to return and take Perez's seat when at the time may or may not come throughout the rest of the season, or, well, certainly into next season. I know that there's a lot of people predicting that Ricciardo to replace Perez for 2024 is a viable option. Now, Horner has kind of denied this, and Helmut Marko's denied this, and Perez said it's not a threat, but, let's be honest here, people are talking about this probably for an understandable reason. So very much interested your thoughts in the comment section below. Just one final thing here to mention before we do go into the weekends, that the final driver, or the most recent driver, to have won the final race of one season and then won the first race of the next season was Nico Rosberg all the way back in 2015-16. So Verstappen would break a record for quite some years if he was to be able to win an Abu Dhabi 2022, and then he was to take the Bahrain victory here for 2023. But hit the like button if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new, take care, and I'll see you next time.